There are two types of recipes in Panda CSS. You have the atomic recipes and you have the config recipes. Atomic recipes are the recipes that output as atomic classes. So here I have a button recipe and we can check how this outputs in the DOM. So I'm just going to inspect this and then I can see that all of these are atomic classes. This tells us that this is an atomic button recipe. So for us to convert our atomic button recipe into a config recipe, I'll be showing you how to do that in this video. Config recipes are very useful because, only the recipes and the variants that you use are actually going to exist in the generated CSS style sheet. So I have my button recipe that I've created with the CVA function. And in order to convert it, I can do this in the Panda config file. I'm going to import the define recipe function. And after doing this, I can then create my recipe very similarly to how I created the atomic recipe. In fact, let's copy this and paste in here. But however, instead of the CVA function, I'm going to switch it into the define recipe function that I just imported at the top. Now, one thing I need to do here is to give my recipe a class name, and this class name acts as like a container for all of this, styles that I'll be defining. So since this is a button, I'm going to give this recipe a class name called button. Yeah, I can also go ahead to give it a description, but that is totally optional. The next thing is to define the recipe that I've created in the config path. So here I'm just going to call, define recipes as a property and call this a button and point it to the button recipe that I've created. And this way, this is really all we need to create a config recipe. So we go back into our code and I'm going to show you the difference between the atomic and the config recipe, how it outputs. So the first thing we need to do is to import the button config recipe that we created earlier. I'm just going to import it from start system/recipes. And that way we can then use our button right here. So I'm going to copy this. And then we'll see how this changes. Remember, we imported the button. So instead of the button recipe here, we're going to use the button that we actually imported. And I can give this a, visual of primary. So now let's go ahead to inspect this and we see how it outputs. So we see the output of this. We can instantly see that it outputs as a config. That means all the styles are bundled into the button recipe that we created. So we see button and button visual primary, which is what we define here, as opposed to this that is atomic class names. So this is really a smart way to create recipes in Panda CSS, because with config recipes, you only get the output of the variants and the recipes that you use in your code.